Greetings, Culture Warriors. This is Jeff Vieira, author of Culture is Everything, bringing you another dispatch from the front. Today we have an interesting story. I want to take a look a little bit deeper at another company here. Johnson & Johnson was recently named a 2020 Fortune World's Most Admired Company. So I got an article here, comes from Johnson & Johnson. But especially with the pandemic ongoing, companies like Johnson & Johnson, of course, are under the spotlight. So it seems like a good time to take a look at their culture and how they're doing. This is from a story from January. Innovativeness and a commitment to social responsibility are just some of the respected attributes that helped the company land on the prestigious list for another year. For the 18th year, Johnson & Johnson has been named to Fortune's list of the world's most admired companies. Johnson & Johnson also placed number 1 in the pharmaceutical category worldwide for the 7th consecutive year. To compile the international list, Fortune magazine partners with consulting firm Korn Ferry to survey industry analysts as well as top executives and directors from Fortune 1000, Global 500, and other major non-U.S. companies. Their remit: identify companies with the strongest reputations based on a mix of 9 attributes, including innovativeness, social responsibility to the community, and the ability to attract and retain talented people. One of the key tenets in Johnson & Johnson's guiding mission statement, our credo, is a responsibility to be a consistent positive force as it helps tackle some of the world's most pressing unmet healthcare needs. The company marked many positive milestones in this regard in 2019, including the U.S. Food and Drug Administration approval of a treatment from the Janssen Pharmaceuticals company of Johnson & Johnson that may help provide more hope for some patients living with metastatic urothelial cancer. Johnson & Johnson also made a commitment to donate up to 500,000 doses of an investigational Janssen vaccine regimen to the Democratic Republic of the Congo to help combat the world's second worst outbreak of Ebola on record. In 2019, it also launched the Mosaico trial at approximately 55 clinical trial sites across North America, South America, and Europe to evaluate a mosaic-based vaccine concept for HIV prevention. The company culture of innovation isn't just limited to scientific research and development either. After appearing on its list for more than 3 decades, Johnson & Johnson nabbed the number 1 spot on Working Mother's 100 Best Companies list in 2019 for its vast variety of forward-thinking family benefits, from generous parental leave for moms and dads to backup dependent care and support. Johnson & Johnson is always striving to help improve the trajectory of health for humanity, and the company is proud to be recognized for this work by being named a world's most admired company. So certainly, that is something to be proud of. Making it on that list means that people respect what it is you're doing, and it has some cultural overtones to it. So if, as I posit in the book, culture is what allows a company to fulfill its purpose, then when your company is having such strong performance in terms of recognition in the wider world for fulfilling that purpose, it must say something positive about your culture. It would stand to reason that that would be the case. We heard in their list here of reasons why they were selected for that: innovativeness, social responsibility, ability to attract and retain talented people, something that sounds a little bit like the values or dimensions of the culture that we're looking to maximize. So that criteria that Fortune uses to select these companies seems to be based in some part on the culture of those companies. So let's take a look. They referenced their credo. The values, and it says here from the Johnson & Johnson website, the values that guide our decision-making are spelled out in our credo. Put simply, our credo challenges us to put the needs and well-being of the people we serve first. That's clear value language, right? Robert Wood Johnson, former chairman from 1932 to 1963 and a member of the company's founding family, crafted our credo himself in 1943, just before Johnson & Johnson became a publicly traded company. This was long before anyone ever heard the term corporate social responsibility. Our credo is more than just a moral compass. We believe it's a recipe for business success. The fact that Johnson & Johnson is one of only a handful of companies that have flourished through more than a century of change is proof of that. They find a sympathetic ear with me, of course, because having a strong culture, a culture where the gap between the culture that's desired and what's been communicated and the culture that is being lived day in and day out, I would argue is the recipe for success. Let's take a look at this credo. Our credo. We believe our first responsibility is to the patients, doctors, and nurses, to mothers and fathers, and all the others who use our products and services. In meeting their needs, everything we do must be of high quality. We must constantly strive to provide value, reduce our costs, and maintain reasonable prices. Customers' orders must be serviced promptly and accurately. Our business partners must have an opportunity to make a fair profit. Okay, so that starts out with a clear delineation in terms of the priority of what it is they're trying to do, and then they list a series of things that they value. But the first responsibility is to patients, doctors, nurses, mothers and fathers, their customers, people who actually use their products and services. And then they describe that a little bit more by saying we need high quality, we need to deliver value, we need to reduce costs, maintain reasonable prices, prompt and accurate service. Business partners as well must have an opportunity to be profitable. Moving on. We are responsible to our employees who work with us throughout the world. We must provide an inclusive work environment where each person must be considered as an individual. We must respect their diversity and dignity and recognize their merit. They must have a sense of security, fulfillment, and purpose in their jobs. Compensation must be fair and adequate, and working conditions clean, orderly, and safe. We must support the health and well-being of our employees and help them fulfill their family and other personal responsibilities. Employees must feel free to make suggestions and complaints. Boy, that speaks to the dimension of a quality culture that we refer to as related to decision makers or empowerment. There must be equal opportunity for employment, development, and advancement for those qualified. We must provide highly capable leaders, and their actions must be just and ethical. Now, some of that language sounds relatively modern, so it makes me wonder if that was in the original credo. If it was, he was certainly prescient in some of the concerns of the day. We are responsible to the communities in which we live and work, and to the world community as well. We must help people be healthier by supporting better access and care in more places around the world. We must be good citizens, support good works and charities, better health and education, and bear our fair share of taxes. We must maintain in good order the property we are privileged to use, protecting the environment and natural resources. I'm getting a little suspicious that that wasn't the original credo, not because those are not good things to strive for, but because those were not top of mind concerns in 1943 and probably would not have made it on the list. I could be wrong, but boy, that sounds like it was written yesterday. Our final responsibility is to our stockholders. Businesses must make a sound profit. We must experiment with new ideas. Research must be carried on. Innovative programs developed, investments made for the future, and mistakes paid for. New equipment must be purchased, new facilities provided, and new products launched. Reserves must be created to provide for adverse times. When we operate according to these principles, the stockholders should realize a fair return. Wow, that's a lot of stuff. And so at first blush, when you read that, you start to say, well, we started out good with some clear priorities, but then quickly this became a long list of we musts. And as an engineer, I can tell you that we generally don't like long lists of we musts because that spells highly constrained solution. You're putting your culture in a pretty tight box, and you're setting yourself up that it's going to be difficult to measure all of these things and keep all of these things moving forward in the way you want to, without some real juggling going on. But as a statement of principles, Johnson & Johnson is describing a well-run business which is fulfilling a purpose in society. And that's a very positive statement, surely. And obviously Johnson & Johnson, to their credit, has had some significant success on that. I would ask what Johnson & Johnson does when these values and priorities conflict. Because while it's nice to say we must do this, we must do this, we must do this, we must do this, the more ands that you have in there, the harder it's going to be to have all those conditions be true all of the time. So let me give you a for instance. So some of the items in the package on here, I don't think anyone would argue that we must provide highly capable leaders and their actions must be just and ethical, would be something that we would not support. What do you do when you're striving for equal opportunity in light of that capability? How do you judge the capability? Because at the start, anyway, any category, any class of people that you initially identify as having a concern from an equal opportunity standpoint is probably at the outset not going to meet that definition of the most highly capable at that time. I happen to be a veteran. One of the things since the war against terror began in 2001 has been that, particularly for our combat vets coming back, that there's been some preference in hiring combat veterans. And that's a good thing. But if you bounce that up against where we've got a position open, a leadership position at Johnson & Johnson, and I've got someone coming in who's fresh out of the military, what do I do if the most highly capable leader on paper is someone who's been an internal employee of the organization for a long time, and now I've got a situation where I've got to choose between those things? The answer may be, well, hire them both and rearrange roles. There could be a way through this. I'm just using this as an example of how two statements that are very close to one another in this paragraph and good things that we're aspiring to can come into conflict. Similarly, when we take a look at what they have to say about social responsibility, what do you do when you have a conflict between, let's say, for example, there is a new treatment that comes out. Initially, that new treatment is probably going to be in very limited supply. Do you take care of your home country, which in Johnson & Johnson's case is the United States, versus another nation? We ran into this in my past when we had the Ebola outbreak. And very quickly, Ebola outbreak suits became a hot commodity. And we had to choose, who do we give those Ebola outbreak suits to? Wisely, we chose to prioritize sites that actually had Ebola patients. They moved them around to provide better care. So generally speaking, they were not in the same area as the outbreak when they were being treated. and the people treating them needed to have that personal protective equipment to avoid transmitting the disease. So looking at it this way, in the current pandemic, we, in the initial phases of it, quickly ran out of what frontline caregivers needed in order to effectively treat the disease. If Johnson & Johnson were providing that material and applying their credo to it, how would you practically do that? What would that look like? And again, I'm not highlighting these examples to try and claim that there's a right and a wrong answer there. I'm just exposing that some of these things on a practical day-to-day basis can be in tension. And if we want to live our culture, it's important to have that clarity before we get to that crisis point. Because it's intended that this help our employees behave in accordance with our culture. And in some of these hard cases, they could wind up not quite knowing what to do. And that ultimately is a failure of how we've communicated our culture. And since culture stems from leadership, that ultimately is a failure of leadership. And again, I'm not presuming Johnson & Johnson only has this credo statement. There's nothing in support of it. They don't make it a little bit more concrete. I'm sure they do those things. I'm just using this example to highlight for you how even a well-crafted statement of principles can require some extra work in order to close that gap between the culture we desire and the culture that we actually live. And ultimately, it's leadership's responsibility to kind of talk through some of these things and figure out, can we hone this down a little bit more? If you happen to be a fan of science fiction, then you'll remember a famous series of stories written by Isaac Asimov regarding robots. And he had the 3 laws of robotics, wherein he boiled down very simply how robots could behave. And then in a series of stories, he took that very simple, clean concept that you would think nothing bad can ever come from this, and he generated a whole bunch of drama about how it inevitably would go bad. I mention it here because even when we do a great job of keeping things very simple and indicating a clear priority and trying to account for all possible use cases, the world is complicated. And so we need, we can craft the finest law possible and have it in simple English that everyone can understand, or whatever language our employees are speaking. And we still have to rely to some extent on people's judgment as novel situations arise. So if someone was bringing this credo to me today and saying, hey, what do you think about it? I would say, it's fine as a statement of principles, but before we unleash the culture on this one, let's go a little bit further. Let's simplify it a bit. Let's get it down to a series of what I call optometry tests. Do you see better with A? Do you see better with B? Where see better is replaced by does your company fulfill its purpose better with A or B? And let's hone to get that down to something where 80-90% of the time, our employees, knowing this, will be able to make a decision that we will be happy with. And again, there's no doubting Johnson & Johnson's success. You don't get to be a multiple winner of most admired company in your industry and in general unless you've done some great work on your culture and you're enforcing it and people are living those cultural values out. It will be interesting coming out of the pandemic to see if any of what is currently in this credo, they might reprioritize. Crisis has a wonderful way of doing that. One of my favorite quotes encapsulates this by saying, "Nothing so concentrates the mind as knowing you'll be hanged in the morning." And that's true. Crisis tends to make the noise kind of fall away. So when you see some things that are a little bit more abstract, some things that are a little bit more far afield of the company's purpose, when you start talking about things that are tertiary and quaternary societal benefits from what we do, you're starting to get pretty far away from what the company exists to do. And when we're in a moment of crisis, those things necessarily tend to fall away. Another great quote came from a colonel that I had in the Air Force. This poor man, he was tasked on short notice to take over our logistics group in Florida. The only problem was the Air Force had previously told him that he was going to be stationed in Alaska. You can't get much further and still be in the United States than the distance between Florida and Alaska. So he'd already moved his family up to Alaska. They were from Texas. And then the Air Force basically has said, "Hey, we need you to do this job instead, turn around and go to Florida." So he came out right away, leaving his poor wife to have to do the travel. On the way down, they were visiting family in Texas. And somewhere in Texas, a tornado struck and hit their camper and their trailer with a good chunk of their belongings and destroyed everything. So this colonel is at work, focused on what we need to do for the group, focused on the mission, and he was remarkably calm. It was so unusual that I just had to ask him. I said, "Sir, how is it that you're able to maintain your calm given everything that's happened? I know were it me, it would be awfully hard not to be distracted." And his answer was simple. He said, "Look, life is very simple. You just put out the fire that's hottest and closest to your rear end, and then you move on to the next one." There's quite a bit of wisdom in that. Stephen Covey, among others, has probably made more money off of a slight expansion of that wisdom than anybody else. But the nugget of it is very sound. Focus on the biggest threat now. When you have that one dealt with, worry about the next one. But it doesn't do you much good while you're fighting and struggling and trying to keep things on an even keel. It doesn't do much good to be thinking too much about what else can go wrong. And I think that with a little bit of that focus as well, Johnson & Johnson would be doing their teammates a great service by helping them kind of define their focus in that kind of crisp and handy a way. But what do I know? I am not the most admired podcaster in the world, at least not yet. Thank you, and have a great day.